The slap came so fast I didn't even see his hand rise. One sharp crack, hot skin against cold air, and suddenly the whole table froze. I heard the sound louder than anything else. Louder than the clinking glasses, louder than the chatter, louder even than the radio humming soft country music in the corner. That sound seemed to echo through the kitchen walls, bouncing back at me, reminding me just how small I was in that moment. This is not just a story, it's an experience. Stay with me from the first word to the last because every detail leads to a twist you'll never forget. And then came his laugh. Not loud. Not wild. Just a short, sharp chuckle under his breath. The kind a man lets out when he thinks he's won. My cheek burned, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. I lowered my eyes, smoothed the tablecloth beneath my fingertips and gave him the smallest nod. A nod that told him I was beaten. A nod that told everyone else at the table I was nothing more than what he said I was. But inside, glad I smiled. Because while he thought I was staring at the floor in shame, I was looking at something else. The reflection in the polished spoon by my plate. I could see the bruise forming, yes, but I also saw his face. And for the first time I saw the crack in his confidence. The room smelled of garlic bread and fried shrimp, heavy and sour under the dim kitchen light. The clock ticked behind me, the kind of old wooden one that groans with every swing of its pendulum. It was 7:43 p.m. on a Thursday night. A night like any other except for the fact that everyone saw it this time. His sisters sat stiff in their chairs, hands wrapped around their forks but not moving them. One of them whispered something under her breath, too low for me to catch, though I caught the smirk she couldn't hide. His mother adjusted her glasses, her lips pressed thin, and then she looked down at her plate as if nothing had happened. And my father just cleared his throat. Loud, firm, final. The sound of a man deciding this was not his fight. The silence that followed cut deeper than the slap. I dabbed at the corner of my mouth with a napkin even though there was no blood there. Not yet, at least. The fabric scratched against my skin, and for a moment I wondered if anyone could see my hand shaking. I steadied it by pressing it down flat on the table. "Pass the butter," I said, my voice even. Calm. Almost too calm. That was my gift, my curse, my secret. No matter how much fire burned inside me, I could sound like ice. My husband grinned, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his table. "See," he said, waving one hand in the air as if he'd proven something. "She knows her place." The chuckle returned, low and bitter. A warning to me, a lesson to the others. But that laugh. Oh, that laugh did more than sting. It carved a promise into my bones. I reached for the serving spoon and ladled shrimp onto his plate, the steam curling into the air, carrying with it the faint tang of lemon and something else. Something not quite right. He didn't notice. None of them did. But I did. I had noticed earlier while the food sat out too long on the counter. I had noticed the way the shrimp's color dulled, the way the air around it felt too warm. I had seen the little details no one else cared to look for. And in that moment I realized something. They might laugh at me, mock me, silence me, but I was the one who saw everything. I had the advantage no one else even knew existed. "Eat," I whispered, setting the plate down in front of him. He didn't hear the tone. No one ever did. That was my other advantage. I could make my words sound like obedience but mean something entirely different. I watched his hand reach for the fork, watched the shrimp disappear into his mouth, watched him chew as if nothing could touch him. But he hadn't touched me. Not really. Not yet. My cheek throbbed. My hand stung from pressing too tightly against the tablecloth. My heart pounded, steady as the clock behind me, ticking, ticking, ticking. And then, like the sound of a gun cocking, I heard the scrape of his chair as he leaned in close to me. "You'll remember this next time," he murmured, low enough that only I could hear. His breath smelled of wine and shrimp. His words dripped with the kind of power men think they're born to wield. I didn't move. Didn't answer. Didn't even blink. Instead, I lifted my eyes, finally meeting his. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something steadier. Something colder. Something that made him pause for half a second too long. He thought it was surrender. He thought it was the look of a woman broken in half. But it wasn't. It was the look of a woman who had already started planning. The kitchen light flickered overhead once, then twice. A storm must have been rolling in. I could smell the rain in the air. The faint hiss of wind slipped through the crack of the old window above the sink. The timing felt almost perfect. Nature itself leaning in closer, holding its breath with me. I heard the faintest groan of the refrigerator motor struggling to hum back to life after the flicker. I noticed the shrimp platter sweating on the table, the ice melting faster than it should. Little things. Ordinary things. Things no one else would ever care about. But to me, they were signs. Clues. Reminders. That even in silence, the world leaves traces of truth. He reached out suddenly, gripping my chin, forcing me to face him fully. His thumb pressed against the very spot his hand had struck. The sting flared again, sharp and humiliating. "Look at me when I talk to you," he said. So I did. And in that moment something inside me shifted. Not broken. Not crushed. But sharpened, honed like the edge of a blade. I didn't pull away. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just let him see me. The real me. The me that wasn't afraid anymore. And for the briefest flicker, just one heartbeat, I saw it in his eyes. The unease. The tiniest whisper of doubt. The laughter around the table tried to return. His sisters snickered nervously, his mother sighed, my father sipped his drink. Everyone eager to move on, eager to pretend nothing had happened. But I didn't move on. I stayed locked in that stare, cheek burning under his hand, heart steady, breath slow. And as his laughter finally broke the silence again, echoing through the kitchen walls, I smiled. Not wide. Not bright. Just enough for him to wonder. Just enough for him to question, even if he'd never admit it. Because the truth was simple. He might have thought he won. But the game had only just begun. I smiled just enough for him to wonder. And that was when the silence came back, heavier than before, pressing down on the table like a second tablecloth. His sisters leaned into each other, whispering through the corners of their mouths. Their bracelets clinked against their forks, their giggles sharp and careless, like teenagers instead of grown women. One of them muttered something about me finally learning, and the other snorted, hiding her laugh behind a sip of wine. His mother never looked up. She pushed peas around her plate as though rearranging them could make the whole scene disappear. Her lips stayed pressed together the same way they always had when her son did wrong. As if her silence could make it someone else's problem. And my father, oh my father. He stared at his glass of iced tea, swirling the cubes until they clinked together. He wouldn't look at me. Wouldn't look at him. Wouldn't look at anyone. That, more than the sting on my cheek, cut me wide open. Because I realized right then, their silence hurt worse than his hand ever could. I folded the napkin on my lap into a tight square, neat corners, careful creases. It gave me something to do, something to keep my hands from shaking. I wasn't crying. I wouldn't give them that. Instead I listened. The air conditioner hummed through the vents. The clock behind me ticked steady, louder than the voices. The smell of fried shrimp and butter clung to the air, thicker now, almost sour. My cheek throbbed with every heartbeat, but what stayed with me wasn't the pain. It was the way nobody spoke up. The ones who laughed, the ones who looked away, even the one who raised me. Not a single word for me. Not one. And it was in that hollow space, carved out by their silence, that something stronger took root. "Dinner's getting cold," his mother said finally, her voice clipped, practical. She didn't mean the food. He meant me. She meant, don't ruin the evening any further. I pressed the folded napkin against my cheek as if wiping away crumbs. "Of course," I whispered, my voice steady. My husband smirked again, satisfied. His sisters dove into their plates. My father cleared his throat and reached for the bread. Life for them returned to normal. But not for me. Because while they filled their mouths with food, I filled mine with silence. Not the silence of surrender, but of strategy. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to the kitchen. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked if I was all right. Nobody cared enough to notice the way my steps faltered or how my hand lingered on the chair for balance. The kitchen was warmer, quieter, but not empty. The platter of shrimp still sat on the counter, slick and shiny under the dim light. The ice beneath it had melted into pinkish water, pooling at the edges. I leaned close, inhaling the faint wrong smell I'd noticed earlier. Too sweet. Too heavy. Food left out too long. Food no one had bothered to refrigerate. And suddenly I understood. Their silence wasn't just cruelty. It was carelessness. Neglect. An arrogance that blinded them to the details I couldn't stop seeing. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the platter, the condensation cold against my skin, and for the first time that evening I let myself smile. Not at him, not at them, but at me. When I returned to the table, they were deep in conversation, ignoring me as easily as they had ignored my bruise. His sisters gossiped about neighbors, his mother scolded them for being too loud, and my father stared at his hands. No one asked why I'd been gone so long. "Everything all right?" my husband asked finally, his tone mocking. I set the platter down in front of him, my hands steady. "Perfect," I said. And in that one word I tucked away everything I felt. The sting on my cheek. The ache in my chest. The loneliness clawing at me. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that silence can be sharper than any blade, and I was learning how to wield it. The meal dragged on. Laughter returned, thin and brittle, but it filled the space. I nodded when spoken to, served when asked, kept my eyes lowered just enough to keep suspicion away. But inside I was watching. I watched the shrimp disappear piece by piece. I watched the sweat bead on their foreheads, though maybe it was just the wine. I watched my husband boast louder, laugh harder, completely unaware of how fragile power looks when you hold it too tightly. Every word, every gesture, every bite, I stored them away. Not because I needed revenge right then, but because I needed proof. Proof of who they were. Proof of who I could become. And proof that silence, once it's mastered, can turn into something far more dangerous. After dessert, a pie his mother brought that no one touched, I cleared the plates. My husband leaned back in his chair, full and smug, while the others drifted toward the living room. My father stood last. For one brief second our eyes met. He opened his mouth. I waited. But all that came out was a sigh, deep and tired. Then he walked away. I carried the plates into the kitchen, stacked them neatly by the sink, and stood there in the quiet. The only sound was the drip of melted ice sliding off the shrimp platter into the drain. And in that sound I heard something I hadn't felt all night. A kind of promise. I pressed both hands flat on the counter, leaning forward, staring down at the mess of water and shrimp tails. My reflection wavered in the puddle, pale and tired but not broken. I whispered to myself, never again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fierce. But it was real. For years I'd thought endurance was strength. That staying silent was survival. But that night, in the silence of their betrayal, I realized something else. Endurance is only strength if you choose it. When it's forced on you, it's nothing but chains. And I was done wearing chains. When I walked back into the living room, my husband reached out, pulling me down beside him on the couch. His arm draped across my shoulders like a collar. He laughed at some story his sister was telling, squeezing me closer as if I were a trophy. The bruise on my cheek pulsed under his touch. The laughter around me grew louder. My father sat in the corner, eyes on the floor. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't flinch. I just sat there, my mind quieter than it had ever been. Because now I understood. Their silence had taught me how to use mine. And one day soon, it would be the only voice they'd hear. The thought sat with me all week, tucked away like a folded letter in my pocket. I went about my chores, hung laundry on the line, scrubbed the kitchen counters, all while carrying that quiet vow. It wasn't rage that drove me, not anymore. It was something steadier, colder, a patience I didn't know I had. By Saturday, the house buzzed with preparations. My husband insisted on hosting his parents' anniversary banquet. "Family deserves the best," he said, puffing up like a rooster. I nodded, kept my head down, and cooked what he asked. But in my heart I knew, this meal would be different. The afternoon sun slipped through lace curtains, scattering patterns across the kitchen floor. Pots simmered on the stove, steam fogging the windows. I wiped sweat from my brow and checked the spread. Roast chicken, baked potatoes, bread rising warm in the oven. And in the center, cooling on the counter, was the platter of shrimp. I touched the dish once, just lightly, feeling the condensation slide against my fingertips. I didn't move it. I didn't cover it. I just let it sit as he had told me. And when I stepped back, I caught sight of myself in the oven door's reflection. My face was flushed, hair pinned back, apron smudged with flour, but my eyes looked sharper. Like they belonged to someone who saw everything. By the time evening came, the house filled with voices. His sisters swept in, perfume thick and sweet, their laughter echoing down the hall before they even set foot in the dining room. His mother carried a bouquet of carnations, fussing about the vase. My father arrived last, quiet as ever, his shoes leaving faint mud prints on the rug. I greeted them all with a smile, polite and practiced. They barely noticed. Their chatter rose like the clatter of birds, shrill and careless. My husband poured himself a drink, clinking ice into the glass. "Tonight," he announced, "we celebrate family." I nodded, standing by his side as though the words meant something to me too. The dining room glowed under the chandelier, light bouncing off polished silver and glass. I set the dishes down one by one, steam curling into the air, the smell of garlic and butter mixing with wine. Then came the shrimp. I placed the platter at the center, its sheen catching the light. The ice beneath had melted into cloudy water, but no one cared. No one noticed. They reached for it eagerly, piling their plates, dipping into sauces, chatting over full mouths. I stood back, hands clasped, watching. "Marvelous," his mother said, chewing. His sisters giggled, pushing forks into each other's plates. My husband raised his glass. "To tradition. To loyalty. To knowing our place in this world." The words landed like stones, heavy and deliberate. Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone but me. I circled the table, refilling wine, fetching bread, nodding at conversations I wasn't part of. My husband's friends bragged about promotions, his sisters mocked neighbors for their clothes, his mother scolded them half-heartedly. My father sat quietly at the far end, sipping water, never lifting his eyes. The noise grew louder, laughter spilling into every corner. They ate with gusto, boasting with every bite. Their pride filled the room thicker than the smell of butter and shrimp. And I smiled. His pride makes people blind. Blind to the details. Blind to the warnings. Blind to the woman standing right in front of them, silent but awake. At one point, his sister leaned across the table, her fork stabbing toward my husband's plate. "You spoil him," she teased. "Look at that serving." He chuckled, shoving another shrimp into his mouth. "She knows her role." The table erupted in laughter, voices bouncing off the walls. I refilled his glass. "Of course," I said softly, though inside the words twisted like steel. My cheek still carried the faint yellow shadow of last week's bruise. None of them noticed. Or maybe they chose not to. That was fine. It only reminded me that their silence had been my training ground. As the evening wore on, I studied them more closely. The way my husband bragged, leaning back with greasy fingers wiping against his napkin. The way his sisters laughed too loud, wine staining their teeth red. The way his mother adjusted the carnations again and again, as though arranging flowers could erase the bitterness in her own home. And my father. His fork moved mechanically, bite after bite, but his eyes stayed down. I wondered if he ever tasted the food at all, or if he'd swallowed silence so long it dulled every other sense. The clamor of voices grew, rising and falling in waves, until I could hardly hear the tick of the clock behind me. But I still felt it. Each second passing, steady, patient, carrying me forward. I leaned down once to gather empty bread baskets, and as I stood, my husband's hand grazed my waist, possessive, careless. He kept his eyes on his friends, never on me, but the gesture burned more than last week's slap. Because now I wasn't shrinking. I was watching. I was remembering. I steadied the baskets in my arms, my voice calm. "Would anyone like more?" They barely glanced at me, forks scraping plates, laughter choking the air. "No, no," his mother waved me off. "Sit, dear." But she didn't mean it. She never did. So I stayed on my feet where I could see everything. Midway through dessert, a small incident broke the flow. One of his friends dropped his fork, sending it clattering onto the floor. He bent to retrieve it, grumbling, and when he lifted it again, I caught the flicker of irritation on his face. "Too much wine," he muttered, though he'd barely had 2 glasses. Another laughed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hot in here," he said, fanning himself with a napkin. I watched quietly. It could have been nothing. Just the wine, the heat, the noise. Or it could have been something else. I tucked the thought away, letting it sit beside my vow. The candles burned lower, dripping wax down their sides. The chandelier light shimmered, softening the room into golden haze. Plates emptied, glasses refilled, voices stumbled over each other. And through it all I stood steady, smiling, nodding, clearing plates, refilling drinks. The good wife. The quiet daughter. The obedient shadow. But inside I was none of those things anymore. Because this feast wasn't theirs. Not really. It was mine. They thought they were celebrating themselves. Their traditions, their pride, their silence. But every bite they swallowed, every laugh they threw into the air, every careless word that dripped from their mouths, brought me closer to something they couldn't see. Something they would never see until it was far too late. When the last plate was cleared and the last toast made, I lingered at the table, gathering the scraps. My husband leaned back, satisfied, one arm draped over his chair. His sisters leaned against each other, giggling into half-empty glasses. His mother fussed over her flowers again. And my father finally looked at me. Just for a second. His eyes tired, unreadable. Then he looked away. The silence between us said more than any words could. I carried the last platter into the kitchen, set it on the counter, and pressed my palms against the cool surface. My arms ached, my feet throbbed, but none of that mattered. Because in that moment I knew one thing with certainty. The feast was over. But their pride, that would be their undoing. I carried the last platter into the kitchen, steady hands balancing its weight, and for the first time that night I let my shoulders drop. The sound of voices still poured from the dining room. Laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of conversation. But it was thinner now, stretched, fraying at the edges. I wiped my palms on my apron and leaned against the counter. The room smelled of wine and butter, heavy and stale. My breath came slow, measured, like I was bracing myself for something. And then I heard it. A cough. Sharp, sudden, muffled under the swell of laughter. Then another. I straightened, my eyes fixed on the doorway, waiting. At first no one noticed. His sisters were too busy giggling, their voices tumbling over one another. His mother scolded them again, fussing over the flowers as if arranging stems could stitch together the frayed edges of the evening. My husband's voice rose above them all, bragging about some deal, his words thick with drink. But then came the sound again. Louder this time. A chair scraping. A fork clattering against a plate. Swallowed wrong, one of the guests said with a chuckle. But the man who coughed didn't laugh. He pressed a napkin to his mouth, his face pale, his shoulders trembling. I stepped into the doorway, unseen at first, and watched. It spread slowly, almost quietly, like a shadow creeping across the room. One man wiping his brow, muttering about the heat. Another shifting uncomfortably in his chair. A woman fanning herself with her hand, her laugh faltering midway. Their pride tried to smother it. Tried to laugh it off. Tried to carry on. But the tremor was there. In their voices. In their hands. In the way their plates sat half-finished in front of them. I stood in the doorway, silent, still, the way I'd trained myself to be. My heart was steady. My eyes sharp. Because I knew. Something had begun. My husband finally noticed when his friend shoved back his chair, clutching at his stomach. "What's the matter with you?" he barked, half amused, half annoyed. The man groaned, shaking his head. Something's not right." His sister snorted, waving a hand. "You just can't handle your wine." But then another cough cut through the room, harsher, deeper, dragging every eye toward it. The laughter thinned. The conversations stuttered. The room, for the first time all evening, began to listen. I stepped forward slowly, my shoes brushing against the rug, my apron brushing against my legs. Nobody spoke to me, but every pair of eyes flickered toward me as if I carried the answer they didn't want to ask for. I said nothing. Instead, I watched my husband. Watched the way his smirk faltered, his glass lowering, his eyes narrowing at the sudden shift in the room. He didn't laugh now. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "All right, enough. Sit down. You're fine." But the man doubled over, groaning, his forehead slick with sweat. And that's when the room truly began to tremble. The chandelier rattled softly from the vibrations of hurried footsteps. Chairs scraped against the hardwood, a jumble of noise. Voices rose, overlapping, frantic, unsure. One of his sisters shrieked, jumping up from her chair. "What's happening?" His mother clutched her carnations, petals trembling in her fist. "It's nothing," she insisted, her voice quivering. Just calm down." But the air was thick now, heavy with panic. The smell of garlic and butter that once made their mouths water now clung like a sour warning. And through it all I stood steady. As I had lived in trembling rooms before. Rooms where silence pressed down like a weight. Rooms where fear lived in every corner. But this trembling wasn't mine. It was theirs. Another cough. Another groan. Another chair tipping backward as someone stumbled to their feet. My husband slammed his hand against the table, his voice booming. "Enough. Everyone sit down." But no one listened. The authority he thought he carried, the control he believed was his birthright, slipped through his fingers like water. The room no longer bent to his will. I saw it in his eyes, the first flicker of fear. He turned toward me then as if I were suddenly visible again, his voice low and urgent. Do something. I tilted my head, my lips curving faintly. What would you like me to do? He didn't answer right away. He stared, caught off guard by my tone, by the calm in my voice. For years he'd heard me speak only in whispers, in apologies, in careful, measured words. But now I sounded different. And he knew it. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the edge of the table. Fix this, he hissed. But I only poured another glass of water, steady hands, steady breath, my eyes never leaving his. Because I knew, this wasn't mine to fix. The noise grew louder. Someone stumbled toward the hallway, clutching their stomach, knocking into the wall. Another cried out, her voice shrill, echoing off the ceiling. His sisters clung to each other, their laughter gone, their faces pale. His mother muttered prayers under her breath, carnations trembling in her lap. My father sat motionless at the far end, his eyes on the floor, his hands folded tight. Me. I stood in the eye of the storm, watching the tremors ripple through the room, watching the cracks widen, watching the pride that had silenced me now crumble under its own weight. One man reached for my arm as he stumbled past. Water, he gasped. I handed him the glass I'd poured. He drank, hands shaking, and for a moment his eyes met mine. Searching. Questioning. But I gave nothing away. I only watched as he staggered off, the sound of his footsteps uneven, the chandelier swaying slightly with each thud. The room no longer felt like theirs. It felt like mine. My husband stood now, towering, his voice straining above the chaos. This is ridiculous. You're all fine. But his face betrayed him. A sheen of sweat on his forehead. A tightness in his jaw. A tremor in his hand as he pointed toward the door. Sit down, he shouted, but his command landed flat. No one listened. The trembling had spread too far. I moved slowly toward him, my apron brushing against my knees, my steps measured, deliberate. He turned to me, eyes blazing, teeth clenched. Stop staring and help, he barked. I met his gaze, unblinking. Help with what? He faltered, his mouth opening but no words coming. His hand twitched at his side, restless, uncertain. For the first time he looked smaller to me. Not weaker, just smaller. Like a man stripped of the illusion he wore so proudly. And in that silence between us, I let him see what he'd never seen before. Not fear. Not shame. But choice. The chandelier swayed harder now, crystals rattling like distant thunder. The air was thick with voices, overlapping, frantic. The smell of sour wine and spoiled food clung to the walls. And through it all I stood face to face with him, steady, calm, my eyes locked on his. Because the trembling had already begun. Not just in the room. Not just in their hands, their voices, their bodies. But in him. In us. And there was no stopping it now. I stood across from my husband, the din of panic swelling around us like a storm. The chandelier shook above, its crystals clinking together in nervous rhythm. Chairs toppled, voices cracked, the air heavy with sweat and sour food. And still I didn't move. My eyes locked on his, steady, unwavering. I wanted him to see it. The calm he had beaten out of me for years had returned, but this time, it wasn't his doing. It was mine. He reached for me suddenly, gripping my arm, fingers pressing hard against my skin. What did you do? He demanded, his voice low, dangerous. I tilted my head, my lips barely curving. Nothing. You didn't serve yourself. His grip tightened, his face reddening, sweat glistening on his forehead. For the first time in all our years together, I saw the fear behind his anger. The cracks in his certainty. Around us the room grew louder. A woman cried out, clutching her stomach. His sister stumbled toward the wall, gasping. His mother's carnations spilled from her lap, petals scattering like confetti on the rug. My father sat frozen, eyes down, but his hands trembled now, betraying what his face would not. Me. I stood tall, unshaken, letting the silence inside me grow louder than the chaos outside. The first guest collapsed by the door. The thud echoed through the room, pulling gasps from every throat. My husband's command cracked in his voice as he barked at them to get up, to stop pretending. But no one rose. One by one their pride buckled. The ones who had laughed at me, silenced me, dismissed me, now doubled over, sweating, choking, their eyes wide with confusion. And still not a single one of them looked at me with recognition. Not one suspected. They had never paid me enough attention to imagine I could be dangerous. That was their mistake. My husband shoved me back toward the wall, his voice breaking. "Tell me what you did." I steadied myself, the cool plaster at my back. My cheek pulsed where his fingers had dug into me, but my voice came out smooth. "I stayed silent," I whispered. His eyes narrowed, confusion flickering before anger took hold again. "Don't play games with me." I leaned forward just slightly, close enough that only he could hear. "You told me silence was my duty. That silence kept this family together. Tonight, silence did exactly what you taught me." I pulled back, watching his face. Watching the realization inch its way through his panic. The shrimp. The platter left too long. The warnings ignored. Not poisoned. Not tampered with. Just allowed. And that was enough. He staggered back, his hand pressing to his stomach now, his breath shallow. His sisters clung to each other, pale and shaking. His mother muttered prayers, rocking back and forth, the carnations crushed in her lap. My father finally raised his head, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I braced for judgment, for condemnation. But all he gave me was silence. The same silence that had betrayed me 1,000 times before. Only now it didn't cut. It freed. Because I no longer needed his voice to survive. The chaos swelled. Guests stumbled toward the hallway, some collapsing before reaching the door. The chandelier swayed violently, crystals scattering light across the walls like shards. And still I moved slowly, deliberately, clearing glasses from the table as though nothing were happening. My hands were steady. My steps even. The same motions I'd repeated for years, but this time, every gesture carried weight. My husband lurched toward me again, clutching the edge of the table for balance. His eyes burned, wild, desperate. "You'll ruin us," he gasped. I set the glass down on the counter and turned to him. "You ruined us a long time ago." His knees buckled and for a moment he caught himself on the chair. His face twisted, a mix of rage and disbelief. "You think they'll forgive you?" He spat, his words slurred. "You think anyone will believe you didn't?" I stepped closer, cutting him off with nothing more than a look. "I don't need forgiveness," I said softly. "I just needed silence." And as his body crumpled, as the room filled with groans and cries, I stood over him, calm, unblinking. For the first time I wasn't the one trembling. Minutes felt like hours as the room descended further. Doctors were called, voices frantic, phones shaking in sweaty hands. The smell of sickness filled the air, sharp and sour, mingling with butter and wine. One by one they were carried out or left sprawled where they fell. His sisters pale and whimpering. His mother clutching my arm, begging through cracked lips, "Help them." I looked down at her, her eyes desperate, her hands clutching mine with surprising strength. And I said the words she had once said to me, "Don't make a scene." Her grip loosened. Her eyes widened. And then she was pulled away with the others. The dining room emptied slowly, the noise drifting out the door, fading into sirens and hurried footsteps. And then it was quiet. The chandelier stilled. The candles flickered low. The carnations lay crushed and scattered on the rug. I stood in the center of it all, my apron smeared, my hair damp against my temples, my breath steady. For years I had carried their silence like a chain. Tonight I turned it into a weapon. And it saved me. My father lingered in the corner, the last to rise. His eyes met mine again, heavy, unreadable. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. I stepped toward him, my voice calm. "You don't have to say anything." He lowered his gaze, nodded once and walked out. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in the house that had once been their kingdom. And for the first time I breathed without fear. I moved through the kitchen slowly, collecting plates, stacking them neatly, rinsing them under cool water. The motion soothed me, familiar, grounding. The shrimp platter sat empty now, streaked with sauce and scraps. I touched its edge once more, the condensation cold beneath my fingertips. It wasn't poison. It wasn't trickery. It was silence. My silence. My refusal to save them. And that was all it had taken. When the last dish was dried, I turned off the light and stood in the doorway, looking back one final time. The dining room was a mess of overturned chairs and half-empty glasses. But to me it looked clean. Clear. Because the weight was gone. Their voices, their laughter, their judgment. All gone. And in their place only silence remained. My silence. The silence that saved me. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I carried nothing with me but the sound of silence. And for the first time it was mine. If this story spoke to your heart, don't leave without subscribing. Join our community of women who love powerful revenge and betrayal stories. And never miss the next one.